The fluorescent lights of the common grounds coffee stand cast a sterile, lonely glow against the deep, enveloping darkness of a late winter night in Anchorage, Alaska. It was February 1st, 2012, and inside the small, glass-walled kiosk, an 18-year-old barista named Samantha Koenig was finishing her closing duties, a routine she had performed countless times. The city outside was quiet, hunkered down against the Alaskan cold. Security cameras, the silent, impassive observers of modern life, captured the scene with grainy indifference. In this mundane end-of-day tableau, there was no premonition of the horror that was about to unfold, no sign that this ordinary coffee stand was about to become the epicenter of one of the most complex and terrifying serial killer investigations in recent American history. This crime would introduce law enforcement to a new and profoundly disturbing type of predator. A ghost in the machine of modern society, a killer whose methods were as patient, meticulous, and ruthlessly efficient as the digital age itself. The initial report was that of a simple robbery and a possible abduction. Samantha Koenig had vanished. The cash register was empty. The scene itself, however, offered few immediate clues. There was no sign of significant struggle, no overt signs of violence that would point to a frenzied, chaotic crime. It was clean, almost clinically so. The Anchorage Police Department responded, treating it with the seriousness any potential kidnapping demands. But their initial working theories, as is common in such cases, were grounded in local probabilities. Was a disgruntled ex-boyfriend? A local drug-related crime gone wrong? A robbery that escalated? They pulled the security footage, hoping for a clear image of a suspect, a license plate, a familiar face from a local criminal database. What they saw on the tape was chilling, not for its violence, but for its unnerving calm and control. The footage showed a masked man approaching the stand service window after closing. He was armed, and through a series of written notes held up to the glass, he compelled Samantha to comply. The interaction was eerily silent, transactional. He did not seem enraged or panicked. He operated with a quiet, methodical purpose. After taking the money from the register, he led a visibly terrified Samantha Koenig away from the kiosk and out into the vast, dark expanse of the parking lot, beyond the view of the cameras. And then they were gone. The investigation in the following days was a frustrating search for a phantom. There were no immediate, viable suspects. Samantha's friends and family were interviewed. Her digital life was scoured for clues, but nothing pointed to a known associate or a pre-existing conflict. The public was alerted, and the community rallied, distributing flyers with Samantha's smiling face, a heartbreaking contrast to the terrified young woman last seen on the security tape. The days turned into weeks, and a cold dread began to settle over the city. This was not following the script of a typical local crime. There was no boastful communication from an abductor, no swift resolution. There was only a profound and terrifying silence. Then, weeks after the abduction, a new and deeply disturbing element was introduced into the case. A ransom demand was made, but it was not a frantic, emotional call from a desperate kidnapper. The method of communication was as cold and impersonal as the abduction itself. A demand was made for a specific sum of money, $30,000, to be deposited into a specific bank account. The bank account belonged to Samantha Koenig herself. This detail was highly unusual and deeply significant to the investigators, as it is a common theme in scholarly analyses of this case. A typical kidnapper for ransom seeks untraceable cash or a complex drop-off. Forcing a deposit into the victim's own account was either the work of a stunningly inept amateur or a highly confident and arrogant professional who believed they could control the digital flow of money and stay one step ahead of the system. Attached to this demand was a proof-of-life photograph. The photo, sent digitally, showed Samantha holding up a recent newspaper to prove the image was current. To her family, it was a moment of gut-wrenching hope, a sign that she was still alive. To the forensic analysts at the FBI who were now heavily involved in the case, the photo was a source of deep suspicion. While the newspaper was recent, Samantha's posture in the photo was unnervingly still, her expression vacant. There were subtle forensic indicators that suggested the scene might have been staged, that Samantha was perhaps not a willing participant even in the act of holding the newspaper. The lighting, the composition, it all felt wrong. It was a perfectly executed manipulation, designed to provide just enough hope to ensure the ransom was paid, while simultaneously concealing the true, horrifying reality of her fate. The ransom was paid. The family, clinging to that sliver of hope, and law enforcement, now using the bank account as a digital tripwire, deposited the money as instructed. Now, they waited. They hoped for a communication, a location, the return of Samantha. Instead, they got silence once again. But the killer had made his first critical mistake. The ghost who had operated so flawlessly in the physical world was about to leave a trail in the digital one. The investigation transformed from a search for a missing person in Anchorage into a high-tech hunt for a transaction. The moment the first withdrawal was made from that account, the chase would be on. The investigators had no idea at the time, but they were not just hunting a kidnapper. They were hunting a man who had turned the entire United States into his personal hunting ground, a meticulous monster whose crimes spanned a decade, and whose true nature was more terrifying than any profiler could have initially imagined. The withdrawal, when it finally came, would not be from an ATM in Alaska, but from one nearly 3,000 miles away, beginning a cross-country pursuit of a man who was up until that moment utterly invisible. In the traditional landscape of criminal investigation, a manhunt is often a tangible, physical process, a methodical grid search, a canvassing of neighborhoods, a following of footprints in the dirt. But the hunt for Samantha Koenig's abductor was to become a defining case study in 21st century policing, a chase conducted not on the streets of Anchorage, but across the invisible, data-rich landscape of the digital world. The ransom payment, deposited into Samantha's own bank account, was a baited hook. The investigators, a joint task force of the Anchorage Police Department and the FBI, knew that the moment their suspect attempted to access that money, he would transform from an anonymous phantom into a data point. He would have to touch the system, and when he did, the system would see him. This shift from a localized abduction case to a national, high-tech financial investigation is a crucial aspect heavily analyzed in scholarly works on modern law enforcement techniques. The wait was agonizing. Days passed after the ransom was paid, and the account remained untouched. For Samantha's family, every hour of silence was a fresh wave of despair. For the investigators, it was a tense period of preparation, ensuring that every possible alert and trace was in place on the account. Then, the first ping came. A small withdrawal was made from an automated teller machine, ATM. The location was not in Alaska, nor even in the Pacific Northwest. It was in a bank in Wilcox, Arizona, a small town thousands of miles away near the Mexican border. The ghost had materialized, if only for a moment. This single transaction provided the first concrete pieces of evidence since the abduction. The ATM had a camera. The task force immediately secured the surveillance footage, and for the first time, they had a potential image of their suspect. The man at the machine was unmasked, a white male of average build, his features captured, albeit grainily, on the ATM's camera. The image was immediately disseminated to law enforcement agencies nationwide, but the suspect was already moving. Before the image could generate any leads, another withdrawal was made, this time from an ATM in Lordsburg, New Mexico. The digital breadcrumb trail was beginning to form, and it was moving east at a deliberate pace. The investigators realized they were not dealing with a criminal who was hunkering down or attempting to disappear. He was on a cross-country journey, a fact that was both baffling and strategically advantageous. His constant movement made him a difficult target for local police to intercept, but his repeated use of the debit card created a predictable, traceable pattern. Each transaction was another pin on a digital map, allowing the FBI to chart his progress across the American Southwest in near real time. The next withdrawal came from Shepherd, Texas, then another in a neighboring town. He was moving through East Texas with a confidence that investigators found both arrogant and deeply unsettling. He seemed unconcerned that each transaction was a flare, signaling his location to a national task force. This confidence is a key psychological detail noted in criminal profiling studies of the case. It suggested an offender with a high degree of narcissistic self-assurance, a belief that he was smarter than law enforcement and could outrun any pursuit. He was toying with them, taking small amounts of money from different locations, as if enjoying the chase he knew he had initiated. The focus of the investigation now converged on the small towns of East Texas. The FBI, working with local Texas law enforcement, began to close the net. They analyzed the locations and timing of the withdrawals, cross-referencing them with other data points. They knew the make and model of the white Ford Focus the suspect was seen driving near one of the ATMs. They began running license plates, checking motel registries, and placing an electronic surveillance perimeter around the area where he was last active. The digital hunt was about to become physical. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place in Lufkin, Texas. On March 13, 2012, nearly 6 weeks after Samantha Koenig's abduction, a Texas Highway Patrol trooper spotted the white Ford Focus parked at a hotel. A quick check of the license plate confirmed it was the vehicle they were looking for. A surveillance team was immediately established. They watched and waited. Soon, a man matching the description from the ATM photos emerged from a hotel room and got into the car. When he drove onto the highway, the signal was given. Marked police units converged, and the vehicle was pulled over on the side of the road. The man behind the wheel was calm, almost placid. He did not resist. He offered his driver's license, which identified him as 34-year-old Israel Keys, a general contractor who lived, of all places, in Anchorage, Alaska. The arresting officers, in their initial search of his vehicle, found a chilling collection of items: a handgun, zip ties, and, most damningly, Samantha Koenig's debit card and cell phone. The ghost now had a name and a face. The arrest of Israel Keys was a triumph for modern, data-driven police work. The trail of digital breadcrumbs from the bank account to the ATM withdrawals to the cell phone pings had led them directly to their man. But as he sat in the back of a police car, his demeanor quiet and cooperative, the investigators on the scene had no idea of the true scope of the horror they had just intercepted. They believed they had arrested a kidnapper and a murderer, a dangerous but likely singular offender responsible for the tragic fate of one young woman in Alaska. They did not know that they had just captured a new and terrifyingly distinct type of American predator, a man who had treated the entire continent as his personal hunting ground. They did not know that the abduction of Samantha Koenig was not the beginning of his story, but merely the end of one chapter in a long and brutal book. The real investigation into the mind and methods of Israel Keys was about to begin in an interrogation room, and what he would reveal would fundamentally alter the FBI's understanding of the modern serial killer. The chase was over, but the chilling journey of discovery was just beginning. The sterile, featureless confines of a police interrogation room are designed to be a psychological crucible. It is a place where facades crumble, where the pressure of confinement and pointed questioning is intended to strip away deception and reveal the truth. When Israel Keys was first brought into such a room following his arrest in Texas, the seasoned investigators from the Anchorage Police Department and the FBI expected a familiar, if difficult, process. They anticipated they would be dealing with a defiant kidnapper and murderer, a man who would lie, deny, and posture, forcing them to meticulously dismantle his story with the weight of their evidence. The ATM photos, the possession of the debit card, the discovery of potential ligatures in his car. They prepared for a long, grueling battle of wills to extract a confession about the fate of Samantha Koenig. What they were not prepared for was the man who sat across from them. He was not a typical criminal, and the interrogation that unfolded would become a landmark case study in criminal psychology and interview techniques, a chilling dialogue that revealed a predator more calculated, self-aware, and prolific than they could have possibly imagined. From the very beginning, Israel Keys did not fit the mold. He was not overtly hostile or panicked. He did not present the wild-eyed look of a cornered animal. Instead, he was calm, composed, and unnervingly articulate. He leaned back in his chair, his posture relaxed, and regarded his interrogators with a cool, intelligent curiosity. This demeanor, as documented and analyzed in scholarly summaries of the interrogation recordings, was the first red flag. It was the unnerving composure of a person with a profound psychopathic detachment, a man who did not feel the same fear or social pressure as a normal individual. He treated the initial stages of the interview not as an interrogation, but as a negotiation. He knew they had him on federal charges related to the ransom. He understood the evidence trail that had led to his capture. Rather than denying the obvious, he acknowledged it with a disconcerting matter-of-factness. This set the stage for the unique dynamic that would define the next several months. Keyes established the ground rules. He was not going to be broken by conventional interrogation tactics. He was in control. He held all the information they desperately needed: the location of Samantha Koenig's body, and, more horrifically, the stories of other victims he began to hint at, and he was willing to trade that information, but only on his own terms. His primary demand was a guarantee of a federal prosecution that would lead to an execution. He was adamant about this point. He did not want to face a drawn-out state trial in Alaska or rot in prison for the rest of his life. He wanted a conclusion. It was during these initial negotiations that the scope of the case began to shatter the investigators' assumptions. In a calm, almost pedagogical tone, Keyes began to subtly correct their understanding of who he was. They thought they had caught a kidnapper who had made a series of mistakes. He explained to them, with a hint of professorial pride, that the mistakes they saw were intentional. He had used the debit card so flagrantly on his cross-country trip. He explained because he wanted to be caught, not out of guilt, but because he had grown tired of the logistical burdens of his lifestyle. It was a planned retirement. He was not a clumsy amateur. He was a retiring professional. Then came the moment that transformed the investigation. In a quiet, measured voice, he looked directly at the lead interrogators and said, "There's more to the story than Samantha." He began to allude to other crimes, other victims, other disappearances across the United States over the past decade. He spoke of them in vague but tantalizing terms, referencing different states, different methods, different years. The investigators in the room felt a cold dread settle over them. They were not sitting across from a man who had committed one terrible crime. They were sitting across from a ghost who had drifted through American society, leaving a trail of unfathomable violence that no one had ever connected. They had not caught a killer. They had stumbled upon a human black hole. His confession regarding Samantha Koenig was delivered with the same chilling detachment. He explained, with no discernible emotion, that she had been killed on the very night of her abduction, long before the ransom demand was ever made. The proof-of-life photograph, he calmly detailed, had been a meticulous and gruesome fabrication. He had used makeup to make her appear alive and fishing line to sew her eyelids open, propping her up with a newspaper to create the illusion that had given her family so much false hope. This single confession was a masterclass in psychological cruelty, a revelation so monstrous that it redefined the investigator's understanding of his capacity for cold, calculated evil. With this horrifying truth established, Keyes began to reveal more about his methods, establishing himself as a unique figure in the taxonomy of serial killers. He explained that he was not like the offenders they read about in their textbooks. He did not have a specific victim type. He did not kill for a sexual signature in the traditional sense. He did not get a thrill from media attention. In fact, he despised it. His primary motivation, he explained with unnerving clarity, was the act of murder itself, the intense feeling of power and control derived from taking a human life. He enjoyed it. He was, in his own words, addicted to it. He laid out his rules, a set of self-imposed guidelines that had allowed him to operate for over a decade with complete impunity. He never killed in his home state of Alaska. He never killed anyone he knew. He always traveled long distances to commit his crimes. often choosing victims in states where he had no personal connections, making a link back to him almost impossible for law enforcement. He would plan his trips months or even years in advance, burying caches of weapons and supplies, which he called his kill kits, in remote locations. This meant he could fly into a city with nothing incriminating, rent a car, drive to a predetermined spot, dig up his kit, and be ready to hunt within hours. As he spoke, the investigators realized the magnitude of what they were facing. They were not just trying to solve the murder of Samantha Koenig. They were now tasked with mapping the secret, violent history of one of the most organized and geographically mobile serial killers in American history. Every piece of information would have to be painstakingly earned, bartered for in a long, complex negotiation with a man who held all the cards. The man in the interview room was both the monster and the sole historian of his own monstrous deeds. The dialogue had just begun, and it would take them on a dark journey across the map of the United States, into cold cases and forgotten disappearances, guided by the calm, articulate, and utterly remorseless voice of Israel Keyes. The mythology of the serial killer, both in popular culture and in early criminological studies, often relies on established patterns. There is the geographically stable killer who preys on a local community, and the nomadic drifter who kills opportunistically along the nation's highways. There is the offender with a specific victim type, a preference for a certain age, gender, or appearance. There is the killer whose crimes are marked by a consistent, ritualistic signature. In the long, chilling hours of his interrogation, Israel Keyes systematically dismantled every one of these archetypes. He explained to the astonished investigators that he had developed his own philosophy of murder, a blueprint so patient, rational, and ruthlessly efficient that it represented a terrifying evolution in predatory behavior. At the heart of this methodology was a concept that is now a landmark in the study of organized serial crime, the kill kit. Keyes was a man who lived a meticulously compartmentalized life. To his neighbors in Anchorage, he was an unassuming and hardworking general contractor. He owned a home, ran a business, and had a young daughter. He presented a perfect facade of normality. But this life was merely a home base, a logistical hub for a secret, parallel existence dedicated entirely to the planning and execution of murder. His work as a contractor gave him two crucial advantages: a legitimate reason to travel frequently across the country for jobs, and a deep, practical knowledge of construction, excavation, and remote landscapes. He weaponized these ordinary skills to create his unique and horrifying system. He explained to the investigators that his crimes were never impulsive. They were the culmination of years of methodical preparation. Years before he would ever select a victim in a particular state, Keyes would begin the first phase of his plan. He would take a trip to a target region: Washington State, Vermont, New York, Texas, often under the guise of a work contract, a hiking trip, or a family vacation. During this initial trip, his sole objective was to bury a kill kit. He would find a remote, secluded location, often in a state or national park, a place easily accessible from a main road, but far from any regular foot traffic. He would hike deep into the woods, find a memorable landmark like a uniquely shaped tree or rock formation, and there he would bury his tools. The contents of these kits, as he described them, and as some were later recovered by the FBI, were a testament to his practical, no-nonsense approach to murder. A typical kit was buried in a 5-gallon bucket, sealed to protect it from the elements. Inside, there was no exotic or specialized weaponry. Instead, he packed the utilitarian tools of a predator. The kits often contain a handgun, a silencer, ammunition, knives, zip ties, a headlamp, contractor-grade garbage bags, and sometimes a shovel or other digging implements. He would also include items for cleaning up, like Drano, which he believed could help obliterate DNA evidence. He would meticulously map the GPS coordinates of the burial site. Once the kit was buried, he would leave. He might not return to that state for months or even years. This method is what makes Keyes a subject of such intense scholarly focus. It allowed him to completely sever the connection between himself and the eventual crime. When he decided it was time to hunt, he would book a flight to a city near one of his prepositioned kits, often using cash to purchase the ticket to minimize the digital trail. He would fly in carrying nothing more than a change of clothes. Upon arrival, he would rent a car, again often with cash, and drive directly to the GPS coordinates he had saved years earlier. He would unearth his bucket, and within hours of landing, he was armed and ready to operate, a fully equipped predator in a state where he had no social ties, no criminal record, and no logical reason to be. This method effectively defeated traditional police work, which often starts by looking for local suspects with a prior history of violence. Keyes was a ghost who could materialize anywhere, commit a crime, and vanish, leaving behind a mystery with no local solution. His cooling-off periods, as he described them, were also atypical. Criminological theory often posits that serial killers have an escalating psychological need to kill, leading to shorter and shorter intervals between crimes. Keyes felt no such compulsion. He could go years between murders. His addiction, as he called it, was something he could control and indulge on his own schedule. He would wait for the urge to build, and then he would meticulously plan his vacation. This patience made him almost impossible to profile using traditional models. There was no predictable timeline, no escalating frenzy that would make his crimes easier to link. The existence of these kits created a chilling new task for the FBI. The interrogation of Israel Keyes became a high-stakes exercise in psychological cartography. The investigators pushed him to reveal the locations of his hidden caches, knowing that each kit represented a potential, or already consummated, act of murder. He would often toy with them, providing vague descriptions or partial coordinates, using the information as a bargaining chip in his ongoing negotiation for a swift federal execution. The recovery of these kits became a grim and urgent priority. FBI teams were dispatched to remote areas of New York's Adirondack Park, to the forests of Washington state, and to other locations across the country, following the macabre treasure maps drawn from the memory of a killer. Digging up a sealed 5-gallon bucket filled with weapons and restraints in a desolate forest was a profoundly unsettling experience for even the most hardened agents. Each recovery was a tangible confirmation of his terrifyingly patient and organized psychopathy. It was a blueprint for murder, planned with the foresight of an engineer and the cold, detached heart of a monster. The kill kits were the central innovation of his murderous career, the key to his long reign of invisible terror, and a chilling new chapter in the study of how the most dangerous predators adapt and thrive in the modern world. In the quiet, pastoral landscape of Essex, Vermont, the night of June 8, 2011, settled with a familiar tranquility. The home of Bill and Lorraine Currier, a well-liked couple in their 50s, was a picture of suburban peace. The lights were off, the doors were locked, and the world outside was still. There was no reason for them to suspect that this ordinary night would be their last. There was no warning that a man who had flown across the country for the sole purpose of committing a random act of violence had, hours earlier, driven past their house and chosen it. Not for any personal reason, but with the cold, arbitrary logic of a predator who had found a suitable target. The story of the Keyes abduction and murder, as meticulously pieced together by investigators from Israel Keyes' own detailed, unemotional confession, stands as one of the most terrifying and complete examples of his methodology in action. It is a scholarly case study brought to life, a horrifying illustration of how his patient planning and detached execution could annihilate a life in the space of a few hours, leaving behind only a profound and terrifying silence. The chain of events that led to that night in Vermont had begun, as was typical for Keyes, years earlier. He had, on a previous trip to the East Coast, buried one of his signature kill kits in a remote area near the Blake Falls Reservoir in upstate New York. It lay dormant for years, a hidden cache of violence waiting to be unearthed. In early June 2011, Keyes decided it was time. He flew from his home in Alaska to Chicago, then took another flight to the East Coast, renting a car. He drove to the reservoir, located the spot from memory and his GPS coordinates, and dug up the 5-gallon bucket. Inside were the tools of his trade: a handgun, a silencer, zip ties, and other implements. He was now an armed and operational predator, ready to hunt. He had no specific target in mind. As he explained to investigators, his selection process was a chilling blend of planning and randomness. He sought what he called a target of opportunity that met a specific set of criteria. He wanted a house that was somewhat isolated but not completely rural, one with an attached garage that would allow him to control the environment and conceal his vehicle. He wanted a home that appeared occupied but not overly active. He spent 2 nights driving through the quiet, darkened residential streets of Essex, Vermont, a town he had no connection to, methodically searching. It was a form of predatory shopping. On the second night, he saw the Kia's home. It fit his criteria perfectly. He parked his rental car a short distance away and approached the house on foot, his kill kit now in a backpack. His entry into the home, as he described it, was a study in practiced efficiency. He cut the phone line leading to the house, a classic tactic to prevent any calls for help. He then moved to the attached garage. He found an unlocked window, broke it, and slipped inside. From the garage, he gained access to the house itself, entering the mudroom that connected them. He was now inside, moving with a ghost-like silence through the darkened home. He passed through the kitchen and into the hallway that led to the bedrooms. He found the master bedroom, where Bill and Lorraine Currier were asleep, completely unaware of the violent intrusion into their sanctuary. The moment of confrontation was swift and overwhelming. He turned on the lights, startling the couple awake. He was armed with the handgun, its muzzle fitted with the silencer. He described how he immediately established dominance, ordering them not to speak. The psychological terror of that moment is almost impossible to comprehend. To be awakened from a deep sleep in the sanctity of one's own bedroom by a masked, armed stranger who has materialized out of the darkness. He bound Bill and Lorraine with the zip ties he had brought. He did not engage in conversation. He did not make demand for money. His purpose was not robbery. His purpose was the people themselves. He forced the bound and terrified couple out of their bedroom, through their own home, and into the garage, where he locked them in their own vehicle, a Toyota Matrix. He then got into his rental car and drove away, with the Kia's car following, its occupants now his prisoners. He drove them north, away from the town and into the dark, rural landscape. His destination was a place he had scouted earlier, a derelict, abandoned farmhouse he had found on one of his reconnaissance drives. The farmhouse was isolated, decrepit, and structurally unsound. A perfect, ready-made crime scene, far from any prying eyes or listening ears. He herded the Kias from their car into the decrepit building. It was here, in the dust and decay of this forgotten structure, that he ended their lives. He explained to investigators that he took Bill Currier to the upper floor of the farmhouse first. There, he killed him. He then returned for Lorraine Currier. In his confession, he detailed her last, desperate act of defiance. Realizing what was about to happen, she fought back, an act of courage in the face of absolute horror. But her struggle was futile. He killed her as well. The final phase of his plan was concealment. Keyes was a meticulous cleaner of his own gruesome work. He knew that the biggest mistake a killer could make was leaving the victims' bodies to be discovered. A discovered body yields evidence. It generates media attention, and it keeps a case alive. His goal was to make his victims vanish completely. He took the bodies of Bill and Lorraine Currier from the farmhouse. The building itself, he knew, would be torn down eventually. He proceeded to dismember their remains, a gruesome task he undertook with the same detached pragmatism he applied to everything else. He then tore down the old farmhouse, a feat he accomplished with his own strength and basic tools, burying the evidence of his crime under the collapsed structure itself. The bodies of Bill and Lorraine Currier have never been found. Keyes returned to his rental car, drove back across state lines to the airport, and flew home to Alaska. He re-entered his life as a contractor and a father, as if nothing had happened. Back in Essex, Vermont, a mystery began. A couple had simply vanished. Their bed was unmade. Their wallets and purses were left behind. There was no sign of a struggle, only a cut phone line and a few enigmatic clues. The case baffled local law enforcement. There was no motive, no suspects, no logical explanation. It was a perfect crime, a complete and total disappearance. For over 8 months, the fate of the Keyes remained a profound and painful mystery. It was a story with no final chapter, a wound that could not close. It would only be solved when Israel Keyes, sitting in an interrogation room thousands off miles away and nearly a year later, decided to tell it. His calm, detailed account provided the only answers the family would ever receive, a horrifying narrative delivered by the sole architect of their tragedy. The detailed, chilling confession to the murders of Bill and Lorraine Currier served as a Rosetta Stone for the investigators interrogating Israel Keyes. It provided them with a complete, terrifying blueprint of his methodology. The long-term planning, the cross-country travel, the buried kill kits, the random selection of victims, the swift, overwhelming violence, and the ultimate goal of complete erasure. As the interrogations continued, it became clear that the Currier case and the abduction of Samantha Koenig were not isolated outbursts of violence, but merely two anchor points in a long and geographically scattered constellation of murder. Keyes began to speak of other crimes, other victims, other echoes of his presence left in the quiet wildernesses and anonymous suburbs across the United States. His admissions, often delivered in a frustratingly vague and piecemeal fashion, transformed the investigation into a grim exercise in national cold case forensics, as detectives tried to match his cryptic clues to the faces of the missing and the files of the long unsolved. This aspect of the case is a central theme in scholarly analyses of his criminal career, highlighting the profound challenges that a geographically mobile, patternless serial killer presents to a fragmented, jurisdiction-based law enforcement system. Keyes was a predator who exploited the very size and structure of the country. A disappearance in Washington state, a homicide in New York, and a missing person in Texas would almost never be linked by investigators operating in their own local spheres. Keyes understood this intuitively and used it to his supreme advantage, ensuring that his murderous vacations were so geographically and chronologically disconnected that no single agency could ever piece together the larger puzzle. One of the earliest crimes he hinted at took place in the verdant, rugged landscape of Washington state, a region he knew well from his time stationed at Fort Lewis during his Army service. He spoke of at least 4 murders committed in Washington, though he remained infuriatingly coy about the specifics of who, when, and where. His allusions sent investigators scrambling through old files, looking for unsolved homicides or disappearances that fit his general timeline and method. He confessed to targeting a couple, though he refused to name them, and disposing of their bodies in Crescent Lake, a deep, cold body of water in Olympic National Park. This detail was significant as it demonstrated another facet of his methodology: the use of deep water as a means of permanent concealment. He described weighting bodies and sinking them, confident that the depths would hold his secrets forever. This confession, while never officially linked to specific known victims, cast a dark shadow over every unsolved disappearance in the region, leaving families to wonder if their missing loved one had been another of his unnamed trophies. The interrogations revealed that his hunting grounds spanned the entire continent. He described taking a boat from Knee Bay in Washington, a small town on the northwesternmost tip of the contiguous United States, and dumping the body of another victim into the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. He spoke of crimes in New York State, where he had buried one of his most extensive kill kits in the Adirondacks. He admitted to traveling to the area, digging up his cache, and searching for victims, though his accounts of what happened next remained clouded in ambiguity. Did he commit a murder there? Did he abduct someone who was never reported missing? His refusal to provide concrete details was a form of psychological torture for the investigators and a source of enduring mystery for criminologists. His victimology, as it emerged through these fragmented confessions, was as terrifying as his geography. Unlike many serial killers who fixate on a specific type, a particular hair color, age, or profession, Keyes had no discernible preference. His primary criterion was opportunity and low risk. He targeted men, women, and couples. His only rule in this regard was a pragmatic one. He avoided targeting children and law enforcement officers, not out of any moral compunction, but because he knew such crimes would trigger a massive, high-priority investigation that he wished to avoid. This lack of victim type made him even more difficult to profile. There is no pattern for profilers to seize upon, no common thread to link the disappearances of a middle-aged couple in Vermont to a young barista in Alaska or an unnamed person in Washington. The randomness was the point. It was his ultimate defense against detection. His own self-awareness of his pathology was another recurring theme in the interrogations, and a point of great interest to forensic psychologists. He clearly distinguished himself from other serial killers he had studied. He told investigators he felt nothing in common with offenders like Ted Bundy, whom he saw as sloppy and driven by ego. Keyes took pride in his own anonymity, his ability to move through society without leaving a ripple. He explained that his primary motivation was a deeply personal, intrinsic enjoyment he derived from the act of murder, the ultimate expression of power over another human being. He did not need public recognition. The act itself was the entire reward. He described this feeling as a powerful addiction, an urge that would build over time until he had to satisfy it by planning another trip. Through this dark tapestry of hints and partial confessions, a portrait emerged of a decade of hidden violence. The FBI was able to tentatively link him to as many as 11 homicides, but they, and Keyes himself, believed the true number was higher. Each unnamed victim represented a family left in a state of perpetual ambiguity, a cold case file that might never be closed. The echoes of his crimes were scattered across the country, from the deep waters of the Pacific Northwest to the dense forests of the Adirondacks, to the quiet suburban streets of Vermont and beyond. Israel Keyes was not a monster who haunted a single town. He was a uniquely American nightmare, a predator who had turned the nation's vastness and anonymity into his personal, blood-soaked playground. The wilderness he left in his wake was not just the physical locations where he buried his victims, but the vast, agonizing expanse of uncertainty faced by the families of those he never named. The study of the serial killer has always been, at its core, a study of motivation. Criminologists and psychologists have spent decades developing typologies to understand the why behind the act. The visionary killer driven by hallucinations, the mission-oriented killer seeking to rid the world of a certain type of person, the hedonistic killer who murders for lust or thrill. When Israel Keyes sat in the interrogation room, he defied every one of these established categories. His calm, articulate, and stunningly self-aware explanations of his own psychology provided investigators and, later, scholars with a rare and chilling direct view into the mind of a predator. The portrait that emerged was not of a man driven by delusion or a grand, external purpose. It was the portrait of a man with a singular, terrifyingly simple motivation. He killed because he enjoyed it. The analysis of his mind reveals a near-perfect specimen of a particular kind of psychopath, a meticulous monster whose pathology was defined by a profound need for power, a complete absence of empathy, and a rational, almost philosophical, commitment to his own predatory nature. The foundational diagnosis that underpins nearly every scholarly analysis of Israel Keyes is that of severe psychopathy. He exhibited all the classic traits outlined in clinical checklists like the PCLR. His charm was instrumental and superficial. He could mimic prosocial behavior flawlessly when it suited his purpose, as seen in his life as a friendly contractor and father. He displayed a grandiose sense of self-worth, evident in the pride he took in his own superior methodology and his intellectual sparring with the FBI. He was a pathological liar, though he used his lies strategically, not compulsively, often to control the flow of the interrogation. Most centrally, he possessed a complete and total lack of empathy or remorse. In all the hours of recorded interviews, as he detailed the abduction, terror, and murder of his victims, he never once expressed a flicker of guilt or sorrow for the people he had killed. He spoke of their deaths with the emotional detachment of an engineer describing a mechanical process. What made Keyes particularly fascinating to forensic psychologists was his high degree of self-awareness. Unlike many offenders who construct elaborate rationalizations to justify their actions or blame external forces, Keyes had no such illusions. He knew exactly what he was. He had studied other serial killers, read true crime books, and watched documentaries. He analyzed their mistakes, their need for media attention, their predictable patterns, their sloppy forensics, and consciously designed his own methods to be superior. He told investigators that he believed he was born with a dark side, a fundamental difference in his brain that separated him from other people. He did not see this as a defect to be cured, but as an essential part of his identity to be managed, and, when the urge grew too strong, indulged. His motivation, as he described it, was purely intrinsic. He was not trying to achieve a sexual thrill in the conventional sense associated with lust killers. While some of his crimes included sexual assault, he stated that this was secondary, an act of dominance rather than the primary goal. He was not a mission-oriented killer. He had no political or social agenda. He was, in the purest sense of the term, a thrill killer. But the thrill was not about the frenzied excitement of the moment. It was about the entire process, the long-term planning, the secret caches, the patient stalking, the total control over another human being, and the ultimate expression of power in the act of taking a life. He told interrogators that nothing else in life provided the same intense feeling. This internal, self-contained reward system is what made him so dangerous. He did not need external validation. The act itself was the entire point. This internal motivation distinguished him from the narcissistic, attention-seeking killer archetype. He actively avoided media attention, viewing it as a liability. He often chose to murder victims and then immediately dispose of their bodies, a practice that ensured the cases would likely be treated as missing person reports rather than high-profile homicides. This no body, no crime approach was a rational, strategic decision designed to prolong his murderous career. His pride was not in public infamy, but in his private, perfect execution of the crime. Furthermore, his intelligence and patience set him apart. His IQ was never formally tested in a clinical setting after his arrest, but his articulate speech, complex planning, and strategic thinking during the interrogations suggested an intelligence that was at least average, if not significantly higher. More importantly, he possessed an immense degree of what psychologists call executive function, the ability to plan for the long term, inhibit impulsive behavior, and work methodically toward a goal. The concept of burying a kill kit and not returning to it for 5 or 10 years demonstrates a level of patience and foresight that is almost unheard of in the annals of serial crime. Most killers are driven by a more immediate, escalating compulsion. Keyes was able to treat his desire to kill like a connoisseur, planning his indulgences for years in advance. The final, chilling piece of his psychological puzzle was his complete lack of a why in the traditional sense. He had no history of the kind of severe, documentable childhood abuse that is often seen as a formative trauma in the lives of other serial killers. He described his upbringing in a survivalist Mormon family as unusual, but not overtly abusive. He did not offer a narrative of being wronged by society or by a particular type of person. His pathology appeared to be, in his own view and in the view of many who studied him, almost entirely endogenous, a darkness that arose from within. This makes him a particularly terrifying figure. He was not a monster created by a cruel world. He was a monster who simply was. His existence challenges the comforting notion that such predators are always the product of a clear and identifiable trauma. Israel Keyes represented something else. The chilling possibility of a rational, patient, and self-aware evil that requires no external justification for its existence. The mind that the FBI painstakingly mapped in that interview room was not chaotic or delusional. It was the mind of a meticulous monster who had simply chosen murder as his life's most profound and private passion. The long, claustrophobic months of the Israel Keyes interrogation evolved into one of the most unique and psychologically complex dialogues in the history of the FBI. It was not a traditional interview. It was a high-stakes negotiation, a protracted chess match played across a small metal table. The investigators held the physical power of incarceration, but Keyes held the ultimate power of knowledge. Locked away in his mind was a hidden atlas of unsolved murders, a catalog of names, dates, and locations that only he could provide. The unraveling of his secrets, therefore, was not a process of breaking down his defenses, but of carefully and strategically bartering for them. This process, heavily documented and analyzed in scholarly works on criminal interrogation and psychopathy, reveals a man in complete control of his own narrative, using the stories of his victims as his final and most valuable currency. Keyes' primary motivation for confessing was not guilt or a desire for redemption. It was in a display of profound narcissism, a desire for historical accuracy. He knew, from his own study of true crime, that once a serial killer is identified, a media frenzy ensues, and investigators often incorrectly attribute dozens of unsolved crimes to them. Keyes could not abide this. The thought of his meticulously planned, perfect crimes being lumped in with the sloppy work of other, lesser criminals was an affront to his sense of pride and accomplishment. He wanted his story told, but he insisted it be told correctly. He was the sole author and historian of his life's work, and he was willing to cooperate only to ensure the manuscript was accurate. This desire for an accurate legacy was inextricably linked to his central demand, a swift and guaranteed execution. He made it clear to the investigators, led by Special Agent Jolene Godin and Anchorage Police Detective Monique Dahl, that he had no interest in spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison. He viewed such a fate as a tedious and undignified end. An execution, however, was a conclusion. It was a definitive final chapter that he could, in a sense, control. He began to use his victims as bargaining chips in this grim negotiation. He would trade the details of a murder for concrete assurances about his federal trial and sentencing. The dynamic was a constant, draining psychological game. Keyes would provide a tantalizing breadcrumb, a vague mention of a crime in Texas, a hint about a body disposed of in a lake in Washington. Then he would lean back, watch the investigators, and wait for them to offer something in return. He reveled in the power this gave him. After a lifetime of feeling like an outsider, he was now the absolute center of attention, the focus of a multi-million-dollar federal investigation. He controlled the flow of information completely. He would describe the setup for a crime in meticulous detail, the kit, the travel, the stalking, only to stop short of providing the victim's name or the exact location. What's in it for me was his implicit and sometimes explicit question. This created a profound ethical and strategic dilemma for the task force, a scenario that is often discussed in scholarly analysis of high-stakes interrogations. How much do you promise a monster to learn the fate of his victims? They needed to keep him talking. Every piece of information he provided could potentially bring closure to a family who had lived in the agony of uncertainty for years. They had to play his game. They engaged with him, listening for hours as he pontificated on his philosophy of murder, treating his chilling recollections with a degree of professional respect. They brought him his favorite coffee and cigars, small concessions designed to maintain a cooperative atmosphere. They were walking a fine line, building a rapport with a man they knew was a psychopathic killer, all in the desperate hope of uncovering the truth about his other crimes. The unraveling was also a process of mapping his travels. The investigators painstakingly correlated his vague hints with his known movements, using credit card records, flight manifests, and rental car agreements from over a decade. When Keyes mentioned a possible crime in the Northeast around a certain time, they could check to see if he had rented a car in Albany or flown into Boston. This fusion of his narrative with hard data allowed them to slowly and methodically build a potential timeline of his violent career. even for the crimes he refused to fully detail. However, Keyes' cooperation began to wane as the reality of the legal process set in. He grew frustrated with the slow pace of courts. His promised swift federal trial was not materializing as quickly as he wanted. He began to feel that the investigators were not holding up their end of the bargain. He grew more sullen, more withdrawn. The flow of information slowed to a trickle. He would go for days refusing to speak about his crimes, deflecting questions with sarcasm or long, philosophical monologues. He had given them the keys. He had given them Samantha Koenig. He felt he had given them enough to secure his execution, and he became increasingly reluctant to give away more of his secrets for free. He became convinced that the investigators were merely trying to extract as much information as possible before he was locked away forever in a system he despised. The intricate game of cat and mouse was breaking down, replaced by a stalemate of frustration on both sides. The investigators knew there were more bodies, more stories locked away in his mind, but the key to that vault, Israel Keyes himself, was shutting the door. The carefully constructed, psychologically charged world of the Israel Keyes interrogation, a world built on a fragile pact between a killer and his captors, was not destined to reach a negotiated conclusion. The long, frustrating stalemate, marked by Keyes' growing impatience with the deliberate pace of the American legal system, came to an abrupt, violent, and solitary end. Israel Keyes had spent his entire criminal career meticulously controlling every aspect of his life and his crimes. He had chosen the time, the place, and the method. In the end, he would not cede control of his final act to any judge or jury. His suicide in his Anchorage jail cell on December 2nd, 2012, was not an act of despair or remorse. It was his ultimate act of defiance, a final, bloody punctuation mark on his own narrative, and a devastating blow to the ongoing investigations that sought to uncover the full, terrible scope of his reign of terror. The scene discovered by correctional officers that morning was one of calculated, self-inflicted brutality. Keyes had hidden a disposable razor blade, and using it, he had slit one of his wrists. But that was not the primary cause of his death. In a final display of his methodical determination, he had also used a bedsheet to strangle himself. He had ensured his own demise with a grim redundancy, leaving no chance for intervention or revival. He had, in every sense, engineered his own execution on his own terms and on his own schedule. This final act is a subject of intense focus in the scholarly analysis of his case, viewed not as a psychological breakdown, but as the logical endpoint for a man whose core pathology was rooted in an absolute need for control. He had lost control of his freedom, and rather than submit to the long, undignified process of lifelong incarceration he so despised, he chose to exercise his final option. He terminated the game. Left behind in his cell, under his body, was his final communication, a series of drawings and a rambling, blood-spattered, 2-page note. This document, analyzed by FBI profilers and forensic linguists, was not a confession in the traditional sense. It was a chaotic, self-aggrandizing, and deeply disturbing piece of writing, a final glimpse into the disordered nexus of his psychopathy and narcissism. It was filled with nihilistic poetry, critiques of modern society, and angry tirades against the legal system. It was not a note of apology, but a final, defiant manifesto. Most chillingly, scattered among the rambling text were dark, cryptic drawings. One drawing was a stark depiction of 11 skulls, a number that chillingly corresponded with the number of victims the FBI tentatively believed he was responsible for. Below the skulls, he had scrawled the phrase, "We are one," a line that has been interpreted by analysts in multiple ways. As a declaration of his own fractured psyche, a statement of unity with his victims in death, or simply a final, enigmatic taunt. Other drawings depicted skeletal figures and scenes of violence, a visual diary of his pathology. This final testament was not designed to bring clarity or closure. It was designed to sow confusion, to amplify his own myth, and to ensure that he would remain a figure of dark fascination long after his death. It was his last act of psychological manipulation. The suicide of Israel Keyes was a catastrophic event for law enforcement and, most profoundly, for the families of his unnamed, unacknowledged victims. The interrogations, which had been painstakingly proceeding for months, were now permanently silenced. Keyes had taken his secrets with him to the grave. The tentative leads, the half-confessions, the cryptic clues about murders in Washington, New York, Texas, and beyond. These were now likely to remain forever in the realm of speculation. The man who was the sole key to unlocking dozens of cold cases across the nation had deliberately and permanently broken that key. In the aftermath, investigators faced the grim task of sifting through the evidence they had managed to gather, trying to piece together a puzzle without its most crucial component. They had the locations of several of his kill kits, which they continued to recover. They had his DNA, which could be compared against evidence from unsolved crimes across the country. They had the vast trove of data from his financial records and travel history. But without his direct confession to guide them, connecting him definitively to other specific victims became an almost insurmountable task. He had designed his crimes to be forensically clean and geographically random, and in death, he had achieved his goal of ultimate anonymity for most of his violent career. For the families of Bill and Lorraine Currier and Samantha Koenig, his death brought a complex and unsatisfying form of closure. The man responsible for their loss was gone, but the chance to face him in a court of law, to see public justice done, was denied. For the countless other families of the missing, whose hopes had been agonizingly raised by the possibility that Keyes might be responsible for their loved one's disappearance, his suicide was a devastating blow. It slammed the door on what may have been their only chance to ever know the truth. He had denied them even the certainty of grief. The echoes in the wilderness he had spoken of were now destined to remain just that. Faint, haunting sounds with no source. A permanent, painful legacy of a meticulous monster who chose to write his own ending, leaving a story filled with blank, blood-stained pages that could never be filled. The abrupt and violent end of Israel Keyes' life did not conclude his story. It merely sealed it, transforming him from an ongoing investigation into a permanent and profoundly unsettling case study. In the years following his death, the details of his crimes and his unique methodology, as revealed through the declassification of his extensive FBI interrogations, have cemented his status as a landmark figure in modern criminology. He is not just another name in the long, dark catalog of serial killers. He represents, in the view of many scholars and law enforcement profilers, a terrifying evolution of the American predator. His case provides a chilling blueprint for a new type of offender, one who is patient, highly mobile, forensically aware, and perfectly adapted to exploit the anonymity of the modern, interconnected world. The scholarly legacy of Israel Keyes is not just in the horror of his deeds, but in the radical and disturbing ways he challenged and ultimately redefined our understanding of how such monsters operate. One of the most significant aspects of Keyes' legacy is his complete dismantlement of traditional geographic profiling. Criminological models have long relied on the concept of a killer's comfort zone, the idea that most offenders operate within a defined geographical area with which they are familiar. Keyes demonstrated that this concept could be rendered obsolete by using air travel and rental cars, and by prepositioning his kill kits years in advance. He effectively created multiple temporary comfort zones across the entire continent. His case serves as a powerful argument for the necessity of national, centralized law enforcement databases and interagency cooperation. He proved that a crime in a small town in Vermont could be directly linked to a man whose life was based thousands of miles away in Alaska, a connection that would have been almost impossible to make without the federal resources of the FBI and the digital trail he left behind. He exploited the jurisdictional seams of American law enforcement, and his case is now a central teaching tool on the limitations of localized policing in the face of a truly national predator. Equally significant is his subversion of victimology-based profiling. Most serial killers exhibit a discernible pattern in their choice of victims, a preference based on age, race, profession, or appearance. This pattern, or victim type, is often a crucial clue for investigators. Keyes deliberately had none. His victims included a young female barista, a middle-aged couple, and, by his own admission, others who remain unknown. His only criterion was vulnerability and opportunity. This randomness was a conscious, strategic choice, a core component of his philosophy of murder. By making his victim selection arbitrary, he made the crimes impossible to link by pattern. This forces a paradigm shift in criminal profiling, moving away from reliance on who the victims are and towards a more nuanced understanding of how and where the offender operates. The psychological profile of Israel Keyes also represents a significant contribution to the study of psychopathy. He was not a delusional or a frenzied killer. He was a chilling example of a highly functional, organized psychopath who demonstrated an exceptional degree of self-awareness and rational planning. His case is often cited in academic literature to illustrate the profound difference between mental illness and a severe personality disorder. He was not legally insane. He was pathologically devoid of empathy. His extensive, articulate confessions provide a rare, first-person account of the psychopathic worldview, a world where other human beings are not seen as fellow souls, but as objects to be used for personal gratification. His stated motivation, the intrinsic addiction to the feeling of power derived from the act of murder, is a terrifyingly pure expression of the predatory mindset, stripped of the usual self-serving rationalizations about mission or revenge. Furthermore, his use of what can be called murder vacations and his long, patient cooling-off period challenge traditional models of serial offender behavior, which often assume an escalating compulsion and a shortening time frame between crimes. Keyes demonstrated that an offender could possess the self-control to treat murder like a scheduled hobby, integrating it into an otherwise normal-seeming life as a father and a businessman. This compartmentalization is perhaps the most socially terrifying aspect of his legacy. He was not an outcast lurking on the fringes of society. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, a man who could build a playground for children one week and plan a homicide the next. Finally, the ultimate legacy of Israel Keyes is a sobering and cautionary one. His suicide left behind a trail of unanswered questions and a vast, painful void for the families of his unnamed victims. The FBI has continued its work for years, attempting to match his DNA and his known travel patterns to unsolved cases across the nation. But for many, the truth may never be known. He stands as a dark testament to the fact that even in an age of unprecedented surveillance and forensic technology, a sufficiently patient, intelligent, and disciplined predator can still operate with near invisibility. He represents a new kind of American nightmare, one born of the nation's vastness and its interconnected transients. He was a ghost in the machine, and the scholarly and law enforcement communities will be studying his methods, his mind, and the echoes he left in the wilderness for generations to come, hoping to better understand and ultimately to prevent the next predator who might choose to follow his terrifyingly rational blueprint for murder.